My name is Michael Lutz. I work for the JRC in the data specification team, and I'm the main technical and data modeling contact point. So I basically have discussed with the teams a lot of the cross-cutting modeling questions, but also in the last few months that lead up to the development of the implementing rule, we've discussed quite a lot of small modeling details for different themes like buildings, like environmental monitoring facilities, and so on. So when I prepared this presentation, I felt I was coming out of a tunnel that I'm into at the moment, trying to prepare the implementing rule. And I needed to go a few steps back to see what's next. And I did that by actually looking at what did we do in the last 2 years actually across the different topics that you've heard in the last few days here as well, and maybe you're also in this very detailed tunnel with the different themes. And so I tried to go a few steps back first before looking at what's next. So I'm going to talk about first what's new in the data specifications Annex 2 and 3 compared to what we had in Annex 1. On code lists, on coverages, observations and measurements, and some mention on the core and extension models that we've heard about quite a bit in the last few days. And then have a quick view of what are some of the next steps, let's say in the next 1 or 2 years that lie ahead of us. So what do we do in terms of the implementing rule development this year, next year? What do we do in terms of technical guidance development? What are the cross-component issues that we have to look at, some implementation issues that we have to face, and then what do we do in terms of developing support for thematic policies. So what's new in Annex 2 and 3? As I said, we have a more elaborated approach to code lists. We've done quite a bit of work on coverages that didn't come up in Annex 1 so far. The same goes for observations and measurements. We have had quite a few discussions on what should be core and what should be extension models and how should they connect to each other and how should they be developed. And then we have quite a few new common data types and common models for coverages, for activity complexes or facilities, for documents, legislation, and then also some additions to the Annex 1 themes of administrative units, for the maritime units, and for the geographical grid. And in the next few slides, I want to focus on the first 4 points. So looking at code lists, they have been quite important for many of the different themes in Annex 2 and 3, mainly to provide an agreed set of values that could have multilingual names that can act as controlled vocabularies for properties of the spatial object types that we use in the data specifications. So, for example, if you have a measurement or an observation, you might want to have a controlled list of the kinds of things that you measure, the observed properties. And we use that instead of free text descriptions in the data models, basically to enhance interoperability. So if you do a query on the data, if you do a search, when you use a term from a controlled list, you have much better chances of if both data providers and data users use the same terms, you will have much better results when you do queries and better interoperability. So that was also the case for Annex 1, but when we looked in Annex 2 and 3, we found a much more diverse landscape for code lists in the different themes. We saw that the use of code lists in the different themes of Annex 2 and 3 is actually growing and has been evolving over the years in many of the different themes. And many of the themes actually had existing code lists that have been developed in the thematic communities over the last few years, and we try to reuse those as much as possible. But then we looked also at the question of who is actually governing those code lists, and there may be some things that might be governed by Inspire centrally, or by other international organizations such as the WMO or the World Health Organization and so on. But there could also be member state specific extensions that allow for specific situations in the member states. On the other hand, we saw quite a lot of examples in the thematic community where it wasn't very clear how the code list was actually being managed, how it was maintained, if it was maintained, what the rules were, who was deciding whether things were updated, and so on. So, in summary, we could see that the existing code lists were varying widely in terms of the structure. Some of them were just flat lists, some of them were quite deeply hierarchical, as we've seen in the case of buildings. The maintenance, as I said, was quite different in many cases, and sometimes it wasn't very clear who was managing and who was maintaining what. And then also we had different formats, different services to deal with. So how do we deal with this variety, with this diversity of code lists? We basically tried to distinguish the code lists and describe each of the code lists using 3 different dimensions. The first one was to do about the obligation. So do we require the use of a value from a specific code list, and do we put that into the implementing rule, that requirement? Or do we leave that, let's say, only as a recommendation that is in the technical guidance, but it is basically open for data providers to use also other values? The second question was about describing the governance. Should it be a code list that is governed by Inspire, where Inspire is maintaining the code lists also in the future? Or is it a code list that is governed externally by some international organization? And in that case, we would have to describe a number of attributes about this external code list, about the external organization that is responsible, the version to be used, how it's available, in which formats, and so on. And the last term that it was quite important in the discussion was extensibility, where extensibility does not mean that you centrally update a common code list, but it means that you allow a data provider to create a local extension specifically for the member state or for the data provider and use values from that local extension. Moving on to the next new topic, coverages. They've been used in quite a lot of themes in Annex 2 and 3, atmospheric conditions, ocean features, energy resources, and so on. And we again had a number of discussions on these and came up finally to some agreement. If you saw version 2 of the data specification, you will find that coverages were used much more widely in version 2 than they are used in version 3 now. And that basically came to the fact that we said, okay, we only try to use coverages in those cases where the thematic community are actually well familiar with this concept and are actually using coverages in their data as well. So many of the themes like habitats and biotopes, species distribution, and so on, removed the coverage view from their models after version 2.